The airport was alive with movement. Voices calling, luggage wheels dragging, security lines twisting like snakes. But in the middle of all that noise, silence fell around one man. A black soldier dressed in plain clothes stood calmly with his boarding pass in hand. He had served his country, risked his life, and carried scars no one could see. Yet here, none of that mattered. Two police officers closed in, eyes narrowed, suspicion burning. Their voices sharp, their questions loaded. He was treated like a criminal before a word was spoken. Within minutes, they had him in handcuffs. Right there in front of stunned passengers. They didn't know who he was, but they were about to find out. Airports are supposed to be equalizers. Everyone lines up. Everyone waits. Everyone takes off their shoes, their belts, empties their pockets into gray plastic bins. But anyone who has lived with brown skin in America knows that equalizer vanishes the moment suspicion walks in the room. The story begins with Captain David Miller, 34 years old, a decorated combat veteran. Bronze Star, Purple Heart tours in Afghanistan and Iraq, his uniform now replaced by a simple navy jacket, jeans, and boots. A face that carried quiet dignity, a man who had spent his life protecting freedom, now simply trying to catch a flight home. David was not flashy. He didn't speak loudly. He had learned in war that silence often carried more weight than shouting. But there was one thing about him that never stayed silent: the color of his skin. Wherever he went, it spoke for him before his mouth ever opened. That morning, the airport hummed with its usual rhythm. Families clustered at the checked-in counters. Business travelers typed furiously on laptops, sipping bad coffee. Children tugged at their parents' sleeves, fascinated by the giantos overlooking the runways. For most people, it was just another Saturday morning. But for David, airports always carried a shadow. He knew the looks, the second glances, the way people shifted ever so slightly when he walked by. He was used to it. He had learned to swallow it down, to keep moving. He reached the security line, boarding pass in hand, passport tucked neatly inside. TSA agents waved passengers through with monotone efficiency. Step forward. Place your bag. Hands up. Move along. David followed the rhythm. When it was his turn, he placed his bag on the belt, kicked off his boots, and raised his arms. The scanner beeped once. The agent looked at the screen, then at David, then waved him through. Routine. Nothing unusual. But in the corner of the security station, two uniformed police officers stood watch. Their eyes didn't scan the crowd. Their eyes fixed on him. Officer Randall, mid-40s, white, broad shoulders, a face hardened not just by time but by prejudice carried like armor. And beside him, Officer Kent. Younger, eager, the type who followed Randall's lead without question. David caught the stare. He felt it. Heavy, unblinking. Years of experience had taught him that danger didn't always come in gunfire. It sometimes came in silence. He picked up his bag, slid on his boots, and moved forward. But he could hear the shuffle behind him. Boots on tile. A radio crackle. A whisper that wasn't really a whisper. You. Stop right there? The voice cut through the hum of the airport. Heads turned. Conversations paused. David stopped slowly, turning to face them. Yes, officer? His tone was calm, respectful, neutral. He had learned long ago that tone could mean survival. Randall stepped forward. Identification. David held out his boarding pass and passport. Randall didn't even glance at the passport photo. He looked straight at David instead, eyes narrowing like he was searching for something wrong. Where are you headed? Charlotte? David answered evenly. Visiting family? Kent circled him, eyes scanning his bag like it held secrets invisible to anyone else. What's in the bag? Clothes. Personal items. Randall's jaw tightened. Mind if we take a look? David inhaled once slow. He knew the law. He knew his rights. But he also knew how fast situations could spiral. He nodded. Go ahead. The bag was unzipped, clothes folded with military precision. A toiletry kit. A paperback novel with a worn spine. Nothing unusual. Kent frowned. Traveling alone? Yes. Randall exchanged a glance with Kent. Something unspoken passed between them. Not evidence. Not logic. Just suspicion dressed up as authority. Passengers nearby began to whisper. Some craned their necks to watch. Others deliberately looked away, unwilling to be involved. The familiar choreography of public racism, spectators choosing silence as the curtain lifted. Randall's tone sharpened. Step over here? David's chest tightened. Is there a problem, officer? You'll find out soon enough, Randall snapped. And just like that, the moment tipped. Can pull the bag aside? Randall grabbed David's wrist. Cold steel clicked shut around it. The sound of handcuffs in a crowded airport cut sharper than any shout. A gasp rippled through the crowd. Children stopped mid-sentence. Parents pulled them close. Wait, why are you arresting me? David's voice carried, calm but firm. Randall smirked. Suspicious activity. You fit a description. The words. Those words. The ones black men in America had heard for decades. Fit a description. A phrase vague enough to justify anything, sharp enough to wound every time. David didn't resist. He stood tall, back straight, his training holding him steady even as humiliation burned. As they pulled him toward the side corridor, his eyes scanned the crowd. Some looked away. Some watched with pity. A few lifted their phones, recording quietly, afraid to intervene but unwilling to let it vanish into silence. David knew what was happening. This wasn't about security. This wasn't about his bag. This was about skin. About judgment. About the quiet, venomous racism that dressed itself up as law and order. Inside the small holding room, fluorescent lights hummed overhead. A metal chair waited. They shoved him into it. The handcuffs stayed on. Kent paced, frowning at the bag again, as if it might suddenly reveal something illegal. Randall stood with arms crossed, radiating authority that was less about law and more about ego. You traveling under your own name? Randall asked. David tilted his head slightly. Yes. The passport you just ignored confirms that? Randall's smirk flickered. Don't get smart. David said nothing. Silence was his shield. He had learned in combat that sometimes words gave your enemy more than silence ever could. Minutes dragged. Questions kept coming. Where are you going? Why are you traveling alone? What do you do for work? Each one sharpened with suspicion, none of them backed by evidence. David answered calmly. Precisely. But with each answer, Randall's frustration grew. Finally, Kent set the bag down empty. Nothing illegal. Nothing suspicious. Nothing at all. Randall leaned in close, voice low. You think wearing those boots makes you better? You think you can walk through here without us noticing? And there it was. The truth spilling out. It wasn't about safety. It wasn't about law. It was about presence. About a black man existing in a space some people believed he didn't belong. David's eyes didn't flinch. He held Randall's gaze steady as stone. But inside, the weight pressed heavier. Not because he hadn't faced danger before. He had faced bullets, explosions, nights when survival was a coin toss. This weight was different. Because here, in his own country, in the place he had fought to protect, the enemy wore a badge. And in that moment, one truth settled: this was only the beginning. The walls of the airport holding room felt closer by the minute. Fluorescent light buzzed like an insect overhead, washing everything in a pale, sickly glow. Captain David Miller sat cuffed to the chair, wrists pressed raw against cold steel, posture straight despite the humiliation pressing down on him. He was a soldier. Discipline was carved into his bones, but even soldiers bleed on the inside. Randall leaned against the wall, arms crossed, smirk carved deep into his face. Kent paced like a dog on a leash, restless energy feeding off his partner's tone. Every question carried accusation. Every glance carried suspicion. Where were you last night? Randall's voice snapped like a whip. David looked up, calm. At the Hilton by Terminal C. You can check the record? I paid with my card. Pretend jotted something down, pretending it mattered. They hadn't asked the white businessman in the suit about his hotel. They hadn't asked the mother with 2 kids clinging to her about her credit card. But David? He was a question mark. A problem waiting to be solved. Randall stepped closer. What do you do for a living? David's lips pressed thin. He knew the answer could shift everything. He could tell them. End it right there. Drop his rank, his service record, his history. Watch their faces drain of arrogance. But something in him held back. Not yet. Not here. I work for the government, he said, voice even. Randall laughed once sharp. Oh, sure. Government. His eyes narrowed. Drug mule? Gang runner? What are you really? David's jaw tightened. He didn't respond. Silence wasn't weakness. It was resistance. Minutes turned to an hour. Passengers outside the holding area had dispersed, but whispers still echoed through the terminal. A black man dragged away in cuffs. People recorded. People wondered. By now, the footage was probably already bouncing across phones and timelines. In the room, the questions kept circling like vultures. Randall and Kent wanted cracks. Fear. Anger. Anything they could use to justify what they had already done. But David gave them nothing. His mind drifted, not away from the moment, but deeper into it. He thought of Afghanistan. The checkpoint outside Kandahar, where he had stood with a rifle slung across his chest, trying to read faces through dust and heat. The civilians there had looked at him the way Randall looked at him now, suspicion first, humanity second. Only then, he had worn a uniform. Then, he had been the one with power. Now the roles were reversed. Kent slammed the bag shut, frustrated. There's nothing here. Randall scowled. There's always something. He leaned in again, close enough that David could smell the stale coffee on his breath. You think we don't see through you. You walk in here all calm, all clean, like you're better than everyone else. But you're not. You're just another suspect. Another nobody trying to slip through. The words pierced. Not because they were true, but because David had heard them before, in different forms, in different voices, all saying the same thing: you don't belong. And for the first time in hours, David spoke with weight. His voice cut sharp, steady as steel. I've spilled blood for this country. Randall froze. The smirk faltered. Kent glanced up, uncertain. David's eyes didn't move. I've buried brothers in flag-draped coffins. I've slept in sand where mortars rained down. And while you were safe at home, I was bleeding so you could stand here and call me a nobody. The room shifted. Silence pressed thick. Randall recovered fast, masking the flicker of unease with a sneer. Yeah. Got any proof of that? David tilted his head, checked the database. Run the name Captain David Miller. U.S. Army? Kent's fingers hesitated on the notepad. He looked at Randall, uncertain. Randall barked, don't waste time. But Kent couldn't shake it. He stepped outside with his radio mumbling into the receiver. The door clicked shut, leaving Randall and David alone. For a moment, the tension was electric. Randall leaned close, his voice a low growl. You think that uniform means anything here? Out there maybe? But in this room, I decide who you are. David's eyes stayed locked on his. Calm, controlled. Dangerous in their refusal to bend. Minutes passed before Kent returned. His face told the story before his words did. Pale, nervous. Randall, he stammered. I ran the name. Randall scowled. And? Kent swallowed. He's legit. Captain David Miller. Bronze Star. Purple Heart. Served 15 years. Special Operations. His eyes flicked to David, then back to Randall. He's decorated? Man, the words landed like thunder. For a second, even Randall had no response. The arrogance cracked just slightly, like a mask slipping off. The man they had dragged through the airport, cuffed and humiliated, was not a nobody. He was a soldier whose name carried weight in halls they had never even stepped into. David didn't move. Didn't smile. Didn't gloat. He sat in silence, letting the truth hang heavy in the stale air. Kent shifted uncomfortably, almost ashamed. Randall, though, straightened his shoulders, covering insecurity with bluster. Medals don't change what you looked like out there. He snapped. You still fit the description, but the words rang hollow now. Weak. Desperate. David leaned forward slightly, voice low but powerful. No. What I fit is your prejudice? You didn't see a soldier. You didn't see a man who's given more than you'll ever understand. You saw black skin, and that was enough for you?" Randall's jaw clenched. But the room had shifted, and both men knew it. Outside, the muffled sounds of the airport carried on. Flights departed. Announcements echoed. Life moved forward. But inside that holding room, something had cracked wide open. Because now the truth was undeniable. They hadn't just arrested a passenger. They had humiliated a decorated soldier. And soon, the whole airport, and maybe the whole country, would know. The escalation had reached its peak. But the breaking point was still to come. The holding room was silent, but it wasn't peace. It was the kind of silence that feels like thunder waiting to break. Randall stood stiff, his authority shaken. Kent lingered near the door, torn between loyalty and conscience. And David, still cuffed, still seated, was a monument of restraint, his dignity louder than any voice in the room. The revelation hung heavy. Captain David Miller, Bronze Star, Purple Heart, Special Operations? Words that could silence a crowd, words that should have commanded respect. Yet here he was, shackled like a criminal. Randall finally broke the silence. "Doesn't change a thing," he muttered. His voice carried less conviction than before, but his pride refused to surrender. "You think your medals make you untouchable. Everyone answers to the law." David's gaze was steady. "Then apply it equally. If I were white, we wouldn't be having this conversation." Kent shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting to Randall. He knew it was true. He had seen the way Randall's eyes had locked onto David the moment he stepped out of the scanner. Not suspicion based on evidence. Instinct based on bias. Randall barked back. "Don't lecture me. You don't know what it's like, being responsible for keeping this place safe." David's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "I've kept places safe, where the cost of failure wasn't paperwork. It was lives. Don't talk to me about responsibility." The words landed like a strike. Kent exhaled sharply, almost in agreement. Randall's face flushed, anger mixing with shame. He reached for the door. But before he could leave, it opened from the other side. A woman stepped in. Airport Security Chief, Commander Lewis. Tall, sharp uniform, eyes that carried authority earned, not demanded. Her gaze swept the room, pausing at David, then flicking to the cuffs on his wrists. "What's going on here?" Randall straightened. "Suspicious passenger? Possible threat?" "We were questioning him." Lewis's eyes narrowed. "Passenger?" She walked to David, took the clipboard from Kent's trembling hands, scanned the notes. And then she froze. Her posture changed instantly. She turned to Randall, voice cold. "You cuffed Captain David Miller?" The air shifted. Randall stammered, "Hey." He was acting suspicious. "Fit a description?" "Kinda." Lewis snapped. "I know this name. I've read the reports. Captain Miller isn't just some soldier. He's a war hero?" Her words sliced the room open. Kent looked down, ashamed. Randall's jaw tightened. Lewis turned to David, her tone softening. "Captain Miller, I am deeply sorry for this. You should never have been treated this way." She motioned to Kent. "Get those cuffs off. Now." The clink of metal as the cuffs released echoed louder than a gunshot. David rubbed his wrists, the red marks stark against his skin. He didn't thank them. He didn't nod. Respect wasn't owed here. It had already been stolen. Passengers outside the glass wall had gathered again. Some had pressed close, recording everything. Phones captured the moment Randall's authority cracked, the moment the truth came into the light. But David wasn't finished. He stood, slow and deliberate, his presence commanding. His voice was low, but every syllable carried weight. "You dragged me through this airport. In front of children. In front of families. You called me a criminal when all I carried was a bag of clothes. You humiliated me, not because of anything I did, but because of the skin I was born in." Randall's face hardened, but he had no words. None that could shield him now. David's eyes swept the room, then locked on Lewis. "This isn't about me alone. This is about every black man who's been cuffed for nothing. Every woman whose dignity was stripped by suspicion that wasn't earned. Today you chose wrong. But tomorrow, if it's someone without medals, without a title, who will speak for them? The room was still. Even Randall didn't interrupt. Lewis's jaw tightened. She wasn't defensive. She wasn't dismissive. She looked at David with something rare in authority, respect mixed with regret. You're right, Captain. What happened here is unacceptable. And it will be dealt with? Randall bristled. Mom, I was doing my job. No. Lewis cut him off. You were doing your prejudice? Don't confuse the two. The words dropped like a hammer. Kent's shoulders slumped. Randall's face burned red. David picked up his bag, sliding the strap across his shoulder. He didn't rush. Every movement was precise, like a soldier reclaiming ground that had been taken. As he moved toward the door, a voice called from outside. A passenger, one of the bystanders who had recorded everything, spoke up loud enough for all to hear. Sir, thank you for your service. Others joined. A quiet chorus at first, then louder. A ripple of voices rising through the terminal. Applause broke out. Not thunderous, but steady, a recognition of dignity reclaimed. David paused, glanced back once, not at the crowd, not at Lewis, but at Randall. His eyes said everything words could not. You tried to strip me of respect, but I never lost it. Then he walked out, each step measured, a soldier unbowed. Inside the holding room, silence pressed hard. Randall shifted uncomfortably under the weight of what had just unfolded. Ken avoided eye contact. Lewis stood firm, her gaze fixed on the cuffs lying on the table. Cold steel, a reminder of how quickly justice can be twisted by bias. The breaking point had passed, but the consequences were only beginning. The terminal had returned to motion. Flights boarding, announcements echoing. But beneath the hum, something had shifted. Word was spreading. Clips of Captain David Miller's arrest were already racing across social media. Strangers were watching, sharing, commenting. A narrative was forming, and this time, silence would not bury it. David walked toward his gate, every step deliberate. Passengers stepped aside not from fear, but respect. Some whispered his name, already passed from mouth to mouth. Others simply stared at the red marks still fresh on his wrists. He didn't need to speak. The image said enough. Behind him, the holding room was chaos. Randall barked into his radio, demanding backup, insisting he had followed procedure. Kent sat hunched, eyes fixed on the floor, replaying every moment with growing shame. And Commander Lewis paced with a storm brewing behind her eyes. Randall, she snapped, do you realize what you've done? You didn't just humiliate an innocent man. You humiliated this entire department. Randall's jaw tightened. I acted on instinct. He fit the description? No. Lewis cut in sharply. You acted on prejudice. There's a difference. And now it's all over the internet. She wasn't exaggerating. By the hour mark, the video was everywhere. Twitter threads dissected the footage. News sites picked up the story. Hashtag spread fin soldier shamed, fey racist cops, fey everyday racism. Clips showed the cuff snapping shut. Randall's sneer, David's calm defiance, and then the reveal. Captain David Miller, Bronze Star, Purple Heart. The contrast was too stark to ignore a hero treated like a criminal. The fallout was immediate. Military veterans spoke out furious. We fought beside men like him. One tweet read, and now he's dragged in cuffs because of skin color. Civil rights leaders weighed in. Journalists demanded answers. At the airport, reporters began to gather. Cameras waited near security, ready for a statement. David, however, didn't stop. He could have spoken then, used the moment to scorch the system that had tried to break him. But he didn't. He moved steadily toward his gate, head high, silence still his chosen weapon. Yet silence did not mean surrender. Inside the airport command office, Lewis convened an emergency meeting. Officers packed the room, tense and divided. This department answers for what happened today, Lewis said firmly. Captain Miller's rights were violated. We treated him like a suspect without cause. And now the world is watching. Randall bristled. So what, we just apologize? Grovel because the man's got medals? Lewis's eyes narrowed. We apologize because we were wrong. Rank or not, no citizen should be cuffed for their skin. A murmur spread through the room. Some officers nodded. Others avoided her gaze, the weight of complicity heavy in the silence. Kent finally spoke. His voice was quiet but steady. What crossed a line? I saw it. I didn't stop it. That's on me. The admission cracked the air. Randall glared at him, betrayal flashing. But Lewis's expression softened. Owning it is the first step. Learn from it. Randall wasn't ready to learn. His pride wrapped tighter, anger hardening his face. But pride could not undo what was unraveling. By evening, news anchors led with the story. Decorated Army captain wrongfully detained by airport police. The footage replayed across screens nationwide. Commentators debated not whether it was racist, but how deep the racism ran in the system. Calls flooded the airport's public line. Some demanded Randall's firing. Others called for broader reform. Civil rights organizations announced they would investigate. And David. He finally reached Charlotte. His family met him at the terminal, tears mixing with pride. They saw the marks on his wrists, the weariness in his eyes. They hugged him tighter than ever, as if trying to erase the humiliation with love. That night, he sat with them at the kitchen table. The news played quietly on TV. His nieces scrolled through the hashtags on their phones, showing him messages from strangers. Veterans, activists, ordinary people. All calling him a hero again, this time not for his service, but for his dignity under fire. David didn't smile. Not yet. He had carried too many burdens to celebrate quickly. But deep down, he knew something had shifted. His humiliation had become a mirror. A reflection of a truth the country could no longer ignore. And back at the airport, Randall's phone rang. Internal affairs. A formal investigation was underway. For years, he had walked with unchecked power, his suspicion treated as law. But now, his authority was under question. His badge, once a shield, had become a spotlight. The consequences had arrived, and they were only growing louder. The storm didn't fade, it grew. By the next morning, Captain David Miller's story was front-page news. Not buried on page 12, not whispered in online forums, but broadcast with urgency across the nation. Headlines screamed, "Hero soldier handcuffed at airport." Anchors replayed the footage of his quiet composure, his refusal to break under Randall's sneering authority. Side by side, they showed photos of David in uniform, saluting, standing before the flag, ribbons gleaming on his chest. The contrast was too sharp to ignore. It wasn't just about one soldier anymore. His story became a symbol. Protests sparked in front of the airport. Veterans marched with their medals pinned proudly. Signs read, "If he's not safe, who is?" and "Honor, not handcuffs." Civil rights leaders used his story as a rallying cry. If a decorated captain is treated this way, what happens to those without a title, without recognition, without proof of their worth? David watched quietly from home. He wasn't a man who sought the spotlight. He had lived years in shadows, missions that would never be told, sacrifices that never reached headlines. But this story, his humiliation, his resilience, was now in the open. The Army released a statement. Respectful, sympathetic, Captain David Miller has served this nation with distinction. We are deeply troubled by his treatment at the airport and stand firmly with him. The message carried weight. Soldiers, black, white, Latino, Asian, shared their own experiences of being profiled in uniform, out of uniform, at airports, in cities. David's story was not an isolated spark. It was tinder to a larger fire. Meanwhile, the investigation closed in on Randall. His record was pulled apart. Complaints from years past resurfaced. Patterns of profiling laid bare. What had once been buried in bureaucracy was now fuel for accountability. Kent, for his part, testified honestly. He admitted his silence, admitted his complicity. "I should have stopped it," he said, voice heavy. "I didn't. That's on me." His honesty did not absolve him, but it began a different kind of reckoning. One where silence was no longer acceptable. Commander Lewis faced cameras outside the airport. Her words were careful, but firm. "We failed Captain Miller. We failed our community. This was racism, and it has no place in law enforcement." For once, the institution did not hide behind excuses. And what of David? Days later, he stood at a podium. A press conference. Not one he wanted, but one he understood was necessary. Cameras flashed, microphones angled toward him. He wore no uniform. Just the same navy jacket, jeans, and boots. The same clothes in which he had been humiliated. His voice was steady. "I didn't choose this attention. I didn't want this story. But it happened. And silence only protects the wrong side. What happened to me wasn't unique. It happens every day to men and women whose names you don't know. The only difference is, mine was caught on camera." He paused, letting the words settle. "I don't want an apology. I want change. Because the next person they stop might not have medals to fall back on. Might not have a title that forces people to listen. Justice should not depend on rank. Respect should not depend on skin." The room was silent. Even reporters, trained to fire off questions, held back for a moment, struck by the weight of what he'd said. When the questions finally came, David answered with patience. Calm, but firm. He didn't let the conversation drift away from the truth. Racism was the root. Not miscommunication, not just doing their job. Racism. By nightfall, clips of his speech went viral, his words carved into the national conversation, not as anger, but as undeniable truth. And slowly, redemption began, not for Randall, whose pride had led to his downfall, but for the countless unseen who finally saw themselves reflected in David's story. People messaged him. Veterans. Single mothers. Teenagers. They thanked him for speaking aloud what so many lived in silence. David didn't call himself a hero. He had buried too many real heroes to use the word lightly. But he understood something now. Sometimes courage isn't on the battlefield. Sometimes it's in a holding room, in handcuffs, refusing to surrender your dignity. Weeks later, reforms were announced at the airport. Training. Accountability measures, SAP. Small steps, yes. But steps born from humiliation transformed into action. And for David, life moved forward. He still caught flights, still traveled, but the scars on his wrists never fully faded. They weren't just marks from steel. They were reminders of a truth he could never unsee. Yet he carried them the way he carried all scars, not as shame, but as testament. Because in the end, his story was never just about one man in an airport. It was about a system that judged before it asked. A system forced, for once, to see itself in the mirror. And David? He walked away not broken, but louder than ever. In the end, what happened to Captain David Miller was more than an arrest. It was a revelation. A decorated soldier? A man who had bled for the very freedoms this nation claims to protect, reduced to handcuffs and suspicion because of the color of his skin. But his story did not end in silence. His composure, his refusal to break, turned humiliation into a mirror. A mirror that forced a nation to look at itself, to ask the questions too often buried. If even a war hero can be treated as a suspect, what chance does the ordinary black man or woman have? The answer is painful, but it is also a call to demand better, to demand accountability from those sworn to serve and protect, to demand that dignity never be conditional. Captain Miller's voice was not raised in anger. It was steady, firm, a reminder that courage does not always roar. It sometimes stands in chains and refuses to bow. And that is the lesson. Injustice can strip your freedom. It can bruise your body. But it cannot take your dignity unless you surrender it. David never surrendered. And because of that, his story became more than his own. It became ours. This is everyday racism drama.